Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here this morning at the Kansas City Museum. I'm Gene Chavez. I'm the historian in residence here at the museum, and I've been with Kansas City Museum since 2013 and have curated a number of exhibits. And the program that we're in this morning is called Nuestro Legado, Our Legacy. And the aim of this particular program series is to tell the untold stories or undertold stories that often occur in history and in the minds of people. So history often dies off when the older folks pass on. But what we're endeavoring to do here at the Kansas City Museum is to keep history alive. And so you're here to help us do that. And again, I appreciate all of you being here today. Well, today we have a wonderful treat ahead of us. We have with us Michael Grauer. And Michael, I met some years back, and immediately fell in love with the work that he does. And those of you who know Michael, you know that he is in fact Cowboy Mike in reality, but he has other hats that he wears. He is presently the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City. He is the McCausland Chair of Cowboy Culture, is the Curator of Cowboy Collections and Western Art. He is responsible for the acquisition, cataloging, storage, research, exhibition, and publication of the museum's historical Western artifacts and art and papers and so forth. So he does all of the scheduling and collecting and exhibiting of Western art, including hunting, frontier armies, cowboys, ranching, rodeos, and everything else that has to do about cowboys, including hats. So he has presently an exhibit on the hats of the cowboy scene, going all the way back to the earliest cowboys, the vaqueros. So today we want to welcome Cowboy Mike. He has a wealth of knowledge that he's going to share with us, and without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mike. Let's give him a hand.
Well, thank y'all for being here. It's really a homecoming for me because in this very room used to be the Igloo exhibit at the Kansas City Museum, and there's a photograph over here on the side that's circa 1968 of some little critters looking at a big a polar bear. And I think I might have been in that picture. They just edited me out. I first came here, and in fact, this is the museum that put that seed in me that perhaps my career would go into public history and ultimately in museums. Really started here, seeing that Igloo exhibit, and it's something that I wanted to be when I grew up. After I was finished being a cowboy, because I knew the cowboy life would only last me so long, and the wages weren't very good, so I figured I had to have to fall back, so museums is where I fell back. But really, this is a homecoming for me. I'm a native of Kansas City, Kansas. I was born in St. Margaret's Hospital, graduated high school in Oak Park, where I met the love of my life right there in the back, Leslie Baker. And it really is a homecoming because in the Stockyard story is something that I remember very distinctly, because my mother's parents lived at 42nd and Fisher in Kansas City, Kansas, and whenever we drove from the northern part of the city to visit Grandma and Grandpa over there, we always drove by the stockyards. I always remember seeing the giant Hereford bull up on the big pylon, and all those things, going by Nigros, et cetera, et cetera. And I have a picture of me in my first pair of cowboy boots. Got a new holster that Christmas as well. And my earliest memories are being on the back of a horse, or hoping to be on the back of a horse, at my grandfather's farm in Marysville, Kansas. And so that's all I ever wanted to be, was grow up to be a cowboy. I wanted to be a professional football player as well, but and I prayed that God above would make me run faster than a 5.2 40 and maybe grow bigger than 5'10". Well, I didn't get there, so now I'm 6'4", and I run a 4.640, and so, you know, the Chiefs just missed out. You know, what are you going to do? But in any case, I was led to be an historian of the American West, and I'm so privileged to do that. My time at KU, let's just say I didn't fit in too well over there, and then when I went to SMU, it was probably the preppiest school in the history of the world. They didn't understand what kind of shoes I had on my feet because I didn't have any shoes, I just had boots. So that's all I ever wanted to be, and the stockyard story is something that haunted me to a certain extent, especially as I read about its demise. My dad was a very active member of FFA, and I remember when Blue Jackets covered this city, absolutely covered them, and I still have Dad's.
Oh, that's great.
I still have Dad's jacket. It meant so much to him. That's all he ever wanted to be, was be a farmer when he got out of the Navy. But he ended up working for AT&T, so we lived in little towns in Kansas, in Missouri, Pleasanton, Concordia, Higginsville, and it was Higginsville where I first came from to see this museum. So that's where I've been led, but the stockyard story is really something that's always been part of my own research, particularly because cowboys come in all different stripes and do all kinds of different jobs, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, particularly because the Kansas City Stockyards, as it says on the first slide, is the biggest multicultural story in Kansas City's history. I should warn you, I'm not a politically correct person, I'm an historian. And sometimes history is painful, but we must talk about it. Multiculturalism for its own sake is a dead end, frankly. Just tell the truth. If you tell the truth, the story's a lot better story anyway. And this story, frankly, is not being told here in Kansas City. In my research, I ran across this quotation from J.C. Nichols, and I know J.C. Nichols is a challenging person in Kansas City's history these days, but I think this says a lot. There would be no Country Club Plaza, and I would go as far as to say there would be no Kansas City as we know it today without the livestock industry. The end, amen. The end, amen. However, this is what you see. It was as if people didn't forget, a giant eraser came out and erased that history from this town. Kansas City is always a cowtown. It was always a cowtown. It will always be a cowtown no matter how many erasers you pull out. It's always going to be that way in spite of things like this that I saw on Wyandotte Street a few years back, and I took the photograph because it just floored me. Yeah, okay, you want to have a what do you call it, craft brewery? Go ahead. But remember, we stand on the shoulders of giants, and those giants were the 35,000 people by some estimates who worked in all the industries in the stockyards all across the board, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, is the people, because most of what we hear about the stockyards is the product. And that's important to remember, as this story is a supply and demand story, just as the cowboy story is. Jimmy Skaggs, a great scholar, wrote about the fact that it was a supply and demand story. There needed to be a workforce to move that product from northern Mexico and South Texas to the railheads in Kansas and to feed the rest of the world. This town fed the world. This town fed the world, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But people were involved with that, and that's what makes it so multicultural. Kansas City's multicultural history starts quite early, obviously, with Native Americans who came here to the confluence of the Kaw and the Missouri River for trading. It was a special location, and they knew that. When the Corps of Discovery came through, they were already multicultural. And I point out exactly where Kansas City is. Sometimes we forget that part, especially with scholars from outside the region. With all due respect to that town 250 miles to the east, which only completed one half of the Golden Arches. They didn't finish the rest of it. That's not the gate. It was a gateway, but it wasn't the gateway. Kansas City was the gateway to the west and still is, and that's what we need to remember. So the Corps of Discovery was very much part of that, obviously, as was the fur trading industry. We forget because we always want that fur trapping and those fur traders who were frequently mixed race people or Native American people to come down the Missouri, and then we want them to end up in St. Louis, where in fact they stopped here first. And that's important to remember. And then moving forward to the greatest trade and international route ever in the history of the United States, frankly, was the Santa Fe Trail. Boxed off, as you can see there, where Kansas City was, as that trail jumping off port moved west to its proper location at Westport, which is, of course, part of what we are now. And if you remember, of course, it's an international story because the trade wasn't just between Westport and Santa Fe. It went south down into the interior of Mexico, as you can see, and then across the Atlantic to the British Isles, to Italy, to France, to Spain, and so on. And that's what's important to remember. And this was a multicultural story. The very first trails actually went east. The trailblazers were Pedro Vial, who was actually a born Frenchman, but eventually became a Spanish citizen. He was Pierre Vial initially, and then it became Pedro later on. But he blazed the trails to what's now Kansas City first in the 1790s, full 30 years, or almost full 30 years before the trail officially opens. And we fail to remember that the trail went both directions. We almost always have trade goods going west, coming back with Spanish silver, when in fact trade goods also went east. And I put this slide up, which I actually co-opted from my friend Gene Chavez from an excellent presentation that he does on the Santa Fe Trail. Not only did the Hispano traders out of New Mexico have their wagons pulled by mules, but the mules were a trade product. There is no Missouri mule without Mexican mules. Don't forget that. So those trade goods were of all different kinds, and the people who traveled on the trail were back and forth, were of all types as well. And we celebrate the Santa Fe Trail here in Kansas City. For example, the murals that hang at the old Savoy Hotel, now 21C Hotel. This is a postcard from that series, and here's a photograph of offloading those goods onto the docks on the Missouri River here in Kansas City, and eventually those trade goods are taken west, but also these boats are also unloading material goods to go back east to New York, to Philadelphia, to Boston, to London, and so on. And that's important to remember, and this was a multicultural story as well. We also need to remember that Kansas City was on the edge of what came to be known amongst the Spanish as Comancheria. This was the area controlled by the Comanches, and as you can see through their trade network, it went all the way down into the interior of Mexico, as far east as the Mississippi River, as far west as the Front Range of the Rockies, as far north as Canada. It's hard for us to grasp that because we want the Comanches to be in one spot, but in fact, through trade and intimidation, they controlled the center part of the United States, and she'd be better known as the Comanche Empire. Scholars smarter than me have written recent scholarly studies that are incredible and thoroughly convincing research about the Comanches, who controlled everything in the middle. And of course, in the Kansas City areas, the Osages and the Pawnees, who were part of that, sometimes as trade partners and sometimes in conflict with the Comanches. Comancheria starts to shrink by the 1850s, and of course, the Mexican-American War played havoc on that western part of the United States that eventually plays a huge role in Kansas City's story. But Comancheria is still part of that, as well as the Mexican presence. Remember, the border of New Spain was the Arkansas River in the southern part of Kansas, which dips down into what's today's Oklahoma. And it went all the way north to the Oregon Territory by 1819. Sometimes we forget that. It's not France that plays the biggest role in American history, it's Spain, followed by Mexico after 1821. And it's an important thing to remember. The hide trade was always important, and I showed you a slide a little earlier about pelts and so on, the beaver trade, etc., primarily driven by fashion, as was the hide trade with American bison. And Kansas City was the principal receiving point for the hides coming out of the West. Largely due to the train travel after 1869, and that's important to remember. And you can see the Askew Saddlery sign. If you know Askew, Askew's building still stands down on Delaware Street, and now it's an apartment or a condominium complex today. But Dodge City became a central gathering point, and those hides came not for lap robes, not for fashion, but to drive the industrial belts for the Industrial Revolution. Because a bison hide, when it's fully tanned properly, is about 3/8 of an inch thick, whereas a cowhide is about 1/4 inch thick. So it was much better leather to drive the machines. And what I'm telling you is, yes, Kansas City was largely involved, if not the primary funnel and conduit for the Industrial Revolution in the United States. Try to find that in the local history books. Part of that hide trade also meant keeping the buffalo hunters supplied at places like Adobe Walls, Texas, which is now in the center part of the Texas Panhandle. And they're supplying, no, I'm not kidding you, this is ironware that was used by the buffalo hunters at Adobe Walls in that short time between June 1874 or April of 74 until the first Battle of Adobe Walls, or Second Battle of Adobe Walls in June 27th, 1874. The reason this plate is broken is because after the battle, which we lasted anywhere from 3 to 5 days, we're not really sure, involved anywhere from 300 to 600 Comanches, Kiowas, Cheyennes, Arapahoes, and Apaches, and 28 men and 1 woman on the buffalo hunter and storekeeper side. Most of the people, the white men there, were not hunters. Most of them were merchants because it was a supply depot. But after the battle was over and the whites fled back to Dodge City, all parts of Adobe Walls trading posts were systematically broken and burned. So you see this burned part of this plate right here. Everything was systematically broken. Everything was burned in an attempt to eliminate all trace of the white incursion, a direct violation of the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867. They weren't supposed to be there in the first place. Ultimately, this results in the Red River War of 1874 and 75, a real quick look, which was a roundup operation to make those Southern Plains warriors, which are critical to the Kansas City story, make them move on to their little corner of what is now the state of Oklahoma in the southwest part. But this also opens up the cattle trade to enterprising entrepreneurs like this young man out of Illinois, Joseph G. McCoy, who immediately recognized that the American diet did a flip after the American Civil War from pork to beef, a complete flip. And so beef cattle were in huge demand. The product, as I mentioned before, was in northern Mexico and South Texas. How do you get that product to the place for the demand? Railroads. And so the Kansas Pacific, through the northern part of the state of Kansas, which came directly here after 1869 and the building of the Hannibal Bridge. That's critical to understand. Initially, those cattle drives went to Abilene, then Ellsworth, then to Wichita, and then further west with the building of the Santa Fe Railway into Dodge City. But getting the product from point A, which is in the southern part of the United States and also the northern part of Mexico, needed a workforce, and that workforce is critical to this story. So initially, this is actually a wonderful photograph of the Kansas State Historical Society showing cattle cars loading out at Abilene, Kansas in 1867. This is really quite a rare specimen. Eventually what happens is those cattle trails spread out like the roots of a tree, and you can see they go all the way down to South Texas. Northern Mexico isn't really on this necessarily, but please remember much of those cattle came, many of those cattle came out of northern Mexico and went north on the initial cattle trail. So the first one, of course, is the Shawnee-Sedalia Trail, which cuts through the southeastern corner of Kansas to Baxter Springs, which was the first cattle town in Kansas, but didn't last very long. They head to Sedalia, and after the Civil War, they head directly here. So what I'm telling you is, cattle drives came directly here before there were stockyards. And eventually that gave rise to the stockyards. And of course, those cattle trails go right through Comancheria, which that problem, as it was called, eventually was solved by the Red River War of 1874-75, and it opened everything up. Frankly, I believe there was collusion in the U.S. Army to take advantage of this great wasted resource, wasted with quotation marks, because the initial attempts were to domesticate the wild buffalo, and you couldn't do it. So that grass, which is what ranchers are in the business of, remember, they're not in the business of raising cattle, they're in the business of raising grass. Go to the Flint Hills sometime and you'll see what I mean. But those trails went right through Native American territory, all of them, and as you can see. So, who were these people? Who were part of that workforce? The very first vaqueros in the New World began with the introduction of the horse in 1519 and cattle following 2 years later in 1521. Roughly in what's now the Panuco Valley in the Gulf Coast of Mexico, and it's that whole tradition spreads north and west, eventually south into South America, where you have gauchos, you have llaneros, you have huasos. All are different words for cowboys. All are different words. But the very first here in what's now the Americas was a person dressed all in leather, as you can see in this watercolor, by Johann Ruendis, one of the earliest known records we have of a cowboy. The very first vaquero here is a black man. No doubt about it. Enslaved black man brought from West Africa, who brought the roping tradition, roping from foot, probably a Fulani, to eastern Mexico combined with a horseback riding technology that came from North Africa. So this is to say, Cowboy Ground Zero is Africa. There's no doubt about it. And eventually, those vaqueros spread north, like these two vaqueros in northern Mexico, roping grizzly bears, not using firearms, because a firearm on the back of the horse is just stupid. And they just get in the way. You might as well carry a claw hammer around in your belt, because they just get in the way. And I know Gene and Roy can shoot the eye out of a rattlesnake from 6,000 yards, but there's no puncher, no hand, no buckaroo ever was able to do that. And so these vaqueros here in Chihuahua, painted about 1909, are roping these grizzlies because, in the words of the famous artist Charlie Russell, loops in swift horses are surer than lead. So this is the way you took care of an apex predator. This way is you roped them and killed them that way, drug them to death or choked them down. This is what happened. So who were these drovers? Who were these men? And they were almost exclusively men, ladies, just so you'll know. They were 75% white men. And cowboydom spreads north, and the farther north you get, the whiter they become. However, they are white men, as you see here. They are black men. 25% are a combination of black, Hispanic, or Native American, a combination. Yes, there are concentrations of, for example, black cowboys to the Gulf Coast of Texas, up into Louisiana, and a little bit into Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma. They're regionally concentrated because that comes out of the Old South. Hispanic cowboys, or Native American cowboys rather, Native American cowboys tended to be regionally concentrated in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, the Dakotas, Wyoming, and Montana. That's where you see them today, some out in Oregon and in Washington, but for the most part, this is where they're regionally concentrated. And Hispanic cowboys, nearly always along the Rio Grande and the Valley, northern Mexico, and so on, out into New Mexico and Arizona. These vaqueros are the ones who are also part of this trail driving story. So bull riding, a big part of rodeo. Look at the crowds, man. Look at the crowds. And Leon Coffey right here, one of the most famous rodeo clowns of all time, of course, is African American. He is also an inductee into the National Rodeo Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City. And of course, anybody recognize these people? What they might have to do with this story? Anybody ever been to Nigro's Western Wear? Here they are. Now, we did have kind of a fuzzy photograph of the patriarch, and I couldn't get it on the screen where it would show very well, but they're always front row, as you can see, at the American Royal Rodeo back in the day in the 80s. Even the governor came to town and visited. Look at that. Imagine that. Coming to the American. This is when I was going as a kid. And where did rodeo start with? Wild West shows. And Wild West shows were about spectacle. This is why rodeos are called the show. They're called a show. They're not called a rodeo typically. They're called a show because it was about entertainment. Feats of daring do, especially beautiful Western girls and Mexican senoritas riding horses. Who wouldn't want to buy a ticket to go see that, of course? And of course, the best ropers everyone knew were Mexican vaqueros like Vicente Oropeza, the world's champion roper at Madison Square Garden in 1901. Roping comes out of Mexico by way of West Africa. And he carries this forward, as did Bill Pickett, who's usually credited as the inventor of bulldogging, today called steer wrestling. He also started his career as a cowboy in East Texas and ran a horse breaking and a bronc busting show in East Texas near Bonham for a while before he moved up to Oklahoma and became part of the 101 Wild West show that toured the country until the 1930s. So these cowboys who came to town, where did they get their stuff? The idea that you could go to a Western store, those early Mexican vaqueros could go to a Western store and buy their vaqueracillas, sillas de vaqueras. Nope, you had to make your own gear. You had to make your all leather clothing. And eventually you came here to Kansas City, especially, you can see there's the Askew building, as I mentioned before, on Delaware Street, but it's the one on the left that's critical to this because Shipley becomes the largest retail and wholesaler in the middle part of the United States for all kinds of cowboy gear. I love this catalog cover here. Look at all the stuff that you could buy at Shipley's. All the stuff, including Crockett spurs, McChesney spurs, Kelly spurs, because all those spur makers were working for Shipley at one time. All of them. Look at the names there. These are all different products that Shipley supplied, including vaqueteada. right here, a leather cowboy hat that reminds us of those first vaqueros wearing all leather clothing. They offered that, suitable for automobiling by women. This was marketed by 1912. So this was the place where you got geared back up, especially if you wanted a new pair of boots. C.H. Hire is usually credited as one of the inventors of the cowboy boot, because remember, those Mexican vaqueros are riding barefoot initially, and later with a sandal, and then later again with a low-heeled shoe. The cowboy boot is really invented in the 1870s by C.H. Hire, John Cubine in Coffeyville, and then also Mr. Justin down in North Texas all discovered the cowboy boot about the same time. I can't get into cowboy boot history. That's another rabbit trail. But you could buy C.H. Hire boots, who offered his boots through Shipley's down in the stockyards, as did G.C. Blucher, who was also in Olathe. This is Buck Jones, the actor, and that's his foot in the order blank in the Blucher boot records, which are at the National Cowboy Museum today. Blucher Boots was in Cheyenne, Wyoming for a while, but came back to Olathe and went neck and neck with C.H. Hire for a while. I'm wearing my Olathe boots this morning because I think they're the superior puncher boots. If you have a pair that you don't have any place for, just give me a call. I'll figure out a way to get them on my feet. So Kansas City was heavily involved with all the stockmen in the West, and just to use as one example, I'm going to talk about West Texas and the Texas Panhandle. They were so deeply involved with the cattle industry, with giants like Charles Goodnight, that they carried his obituary, as you can see in the Kansas City Times in 1929. Goodnight had a great association with Kansas City. He used Kansas City banks, and Kansas City banks, through the Kansas City stockyards, underwrote banks all across West Texas, Oklahoma, western Kansas, New Mexico, and Colorado. So as you can see, the Panhandle Bank, right, is underwritten by the First National Bank. And Charles Goodnight's check, written to W.C. Coburn, W.C. Coburn ran the Shoe Bar Ranch in West Texas. Nearly all the British syndicates that bought ranches by the mid-1880s all across the West, their headquarters were usually in Kansas City. So the Matadors, their headquarters was here. The Shoe Bars, the Cedar Valley Land, the T-Anchors, right on down the line, they were all headquartered here. Goodnight actually had his life saved by a Kansas City doctor and built a pair of hall trees that you see here out of oak using a Kansas City cabinet maker, and the doctor has this. So Kansas City Museum people, somewhere in this town is the mate to this, and it was built and paid for by Charles Goodnight, with him carefully selecting all the buffalo horns to adorn it. That is at my old museum. T.S. Bugbee was the second cattleman in the Texas Panhandle, and he built this house on 31st, as you can see. It was a grand mansion very close to Paseo, and that's where many of the early mansions were built. Alfred Rowe, who partnered with his brothers, who were chemists here in Kansas City, to create the R.O. Ranch, but unfortunately he went down with a boat in 1912, as you can see. His records are preserved at Panhandle Plains, including his wife's diary from 1878 until she moved back to Great Britain in the late 1880s. O.H. Bull Nelson was a Hereford bull marketer out of Burlingame, Kansas, and established the Hereford breed in the Texas Panhandle with Goodnight, Bugbee, and others. But where did he live? He lived here, because this was the center of the cattle industry, and that's key. You even came here if you wanted to get married properly and also on a proper honeymoon, and you would drive 200 miles in the snow. It didn't say that. But he drove 200 miles through sub-zero weather to get to Springer, New Mexico, because it was the only railway to get to Kansas City to get married properly and stay in the St. James Hotel. You can see. That was what you did, because this was the center. It was on everybody's mind. Everybody's mind. Even architects built parts of Kansas City, including Shepard and Weiser, who built the Shipley building in 1910 down in the Stockyards area, but they also built houses, public buildings, churches in Amarillo, Texas, as you can see here, and also built two hotels who are sisters. One on Baltimore here in Kansas City, and one on 3rd Avenue in Amarillo, the Herring and the President. Virtually identical, although the Herring is actually bigger. It has 600 rooms. They built it in 6 months. The construction crew was brought from Kansas City. They set up a tent city in waves. They brought in the concrete men first, then the bricklayers, then the window and sash men, then the framers. They all lived in the tent city and got it done in 6 months with air conditioning. Built in 1926, as you can see. This is the restored President Hotel lobby. That's an old picture of the Hotel Herring. It's slated for restoration soon. But they also built multiple other office buildings like the Amarillo Building, the Ruhl Building, and so on in downtown Kansas City. We also, of course, are part of old Wild West stories like the theft of money on a rail line after selling carloads of cattle in Kansas City. Go back to Canadian Texas and pretend you shipped yourself the cash, only you filled the FedEx envelopes full of newspaper clippings, and then you kill the sheriff when you get there. Oops. That's another story for another day. That's called murder and mayhem. We'll talk about that another time. But all these things are happening up till 1951. 1951. When the flood happens, this is only two photographs. They're too gruesome to see, but it really was the death knell. Kansas City was already wanting to move away from the stockyards by this time, but the flood really is the one that started that precipitous slide. I had the opportunity in 2017 to curate an exhibition called Cattle, Cowboys, and Culture at the Kansas City Public Library. I don't know if any of you got to see it. It ran from September of 17 to March of 2018. And this is what the installation looked like. It was using all artifacts from my old museum, Panhandle Plains Museum, to tell that connection of the cattle trade between Amarillo, Texas, and Kansas City. And remember, that's one segment of this big story about the Kansas City stockyards. That's one story. Yes, sir?
You haven't talked about any of the trouble with livestock and sheep, or the farmers and the cowboys.
That's another story for another day, sir. I'm sorry. I'm doing an overarching talk today. That's a very specific part of the story I'm telling. So hopefully Gene will ask me to come back and we can talk about cowboys and sheepmen at another time. That's another story.
Okay.
Okay? So I'm going to ask my good friend Ron Wilson, who's written a beautiful poem about the Kansas City stockyards. Ron is Poet Laureate of the state of Kansas and also one of the national representatives for the National Day of the Cowboy across the United States. And he's wrote a wonderful poem about the stockyards. And then I'll tell you more about this slide as soon as he's finished.
Well, folks, I'm Ron Wilson. I'm president of the Michael Grauer fan club. I just came along to swell the crowd. We'll be selling T-shirts in the back of the room afterwards. No, I'm a big fan of Michael's, and I've done a lot of work with him, particularly on Chisholm Trail. But he does tremendous work. And Dr. Chavez, I really appreciate the opportunity to come in and thank you for being part of this. So this is the poem I wrote about the stockyards of Kansas City, and there's a connection. My ancestors ran the Poole Dempsey Rutherford Commission Company, which, according to our family story, worked in that big livestock exchange building there on Genesee now, and we're told it was the largest building to ever serve as a livestock exchange. Anyway, stockyards of Kansas City. In the Missouri River bottoms, more than a century ago, traders and trappers met here to make their business grow. In 1870, cattle pens were built by businessmen so bold, this became a central place for livestock bought and sold. Kansas City would grow around the booming livestock sales and become a world leader with the growth that this entails. The livestock producers would bring their cattle here, where packers would bid as they passed the auctioneer. Casey Stockyards became among the largest in the nation, with multi-million-dollar impact on the city's operation. This was the place to be for cattle sales to arrange. They built the world's largest building that served as a livestock exchange. My ancestors worked here, our family records do espouse. In 1949 came the Golden Ox Steakhouse. But then a devastating flood struck in 1951, and beef marketing slowly changed till the market here was done. The pens and the stockyards are gone forevermore, but the legacy lives on in this city's historic lore. Livestock Exchange Building saved. The Golden Ox is back, although the purpose of that building is now on a different track. So we celebrate the history, which we hold in high regards, as we remember the great days of the Kansas City stockyards.
So I'm going to conclude with this photograph. You can count for yourself, but in magnification, I counted 32 men in this photograph. 32. Now you multiply that by the images that I showed you amongst the thousands and thousands of men and women who worked here. This is one of my favorite photographs of the stockyards because it shows everybody had a job. Everybody had a job, from the cattle commission agents out and wherever they were receiving the cattle off the trains to as soon as the animals got here. There were the unloaders, and then there were the unloaders of the dead ones. There were the scales men, there were the gate men, there were the alley men. And then of course they're going to the packing houses. So 32 men that I could count. And not all of them stood still for the photograph because they were working. This is a dock rider right here. That's what you call a cowboy at the stockyards. Here's another one right here. Keep the animals moving around. Dock riders. Nobody says their name. Nobody gives them voice. That giant eraser that came out by the part of this city erased their names and their memory as well. And I guarantee you, the descendants of those people who fed this nation and built this great country, and especially built this great town, their descendants are here. They have their records, they have their photographs, they have their artifacts. Most importantly, they preserve their stories because they're proud of great-grandma and great-grandpa who worked in these stockyards. But we don't tell their story here. It's touched on here at the Kansas City Museum, and I'm so grateful for that. But nowhere else. Nowhere else. Why do we not tell the story of the greatest industry that this town ever saw? Why is that? I have my own suspicions, and that's fine. But it's past time that we told their stories. And I say this a lot. This country was built on beef and bread. It was not built on broccoli. And that beef and bread was created here in Kansas City. Right here. This was the heart of America on many levels. We were the conduit to the world, and we act like we never were. We were something else. But remember, what's the foundation? A great story depends on the foundation, and the Kansas City Stockyards is the greatest and most important foundational story for Kansas City. Thank you very much.
Has Joe Ariano
Yes.
come? Joe, please come up. Well, Mike's closing statement is represented here by Joe Ariano, who grew up on Bottoms and worked at first worked at Armour and then later at Swift & Company. And Joe, would you take about 5 minutes and just share your story of working at the stockyards? And I'll sit down.
I grew up there in the Armour, Wilson, Swift packing house area. And my playground was in the stockyards. I'm 87 years old, and we used to ride the hogs in the pens. We used to bathe in the troughs with the cattle troughs, and that was our playground. We used to swim the river there, which was right there in that same stockyard area. We had so much fun growing up, but that my first job was at Armour's at 17, and I was in the packing house industry all my life. And well, that's where my parents, they were employed there also at Armour's. Almost all the people in that area, they were packing house workers because it was there. There was an area there that was James Street. Armour's packing house was right there at James Street, and that next block there was like about, I'd probably say 12 to 15 families. All of the men worked at Armour's almost, and then Wilson's. That was where the money was at, the packing industry. But that was my life there, because I was born and raised right there in that same area.
What was your experience? Was it a good place to work?
Yes, they paid good money. It was good money.
But what were the conditions like? I mean,
Working conditions?
Yeah, yeah.
The working conditions were good because we had the union. You know, Armors always had the union because it was the biggest packing house in the country. I would say because I would probably say it was like maybe possibly a mile square. It was big. It was huge. And it was right next to the intercity viaduct, which crosses Kansas City, Missouri, into Kansas. And it was huge. But it employed, thousands of people, men and women.
Can you talk a little bit about how the workers formed ball teams? You started out as kids, and then there were Mexican and black teams that played down on the bottoms there at the place called
Yes.
the Patch.
Okay, the Patch, there was the intercity viaduct, goes Kansas City, Missouri, Kansas, and there was like, I'd probably say 16 block square area that was where the Armor packing house was. And it was a vacant lot, and they used to call it the Patch. And a lot of the guys back then, they formed ball teams, and they played ball in that area. And there was no stadiums or nothing there. It was just a patch. But they made their own rules, regulations, and they had good teams back then. And that's, I remember because like I was a kid back then at the time when they were having the ball teams. But like I say, I was born in 35, so that was a long time ago. But my life there was good. Like I say, I started working at 17 years old at the packing house, which they paid good money at the time, and it was always a good business.
Did you ever see a street there called Cottage Lane?
Of what?
Cottage Lane?
A street?
Uh-huh.
No, not in that area. There was only a 1st Street, 2nd Street, and 3rd Street there, and James Street, which James and Central Avenue was the main street where Wilson's was there, Armors was there. There was a state line there, and there was the Call Valley State Bank, which was, they did all the business for the packing houses right there. And there was a slew of bars there. And I'll tell you what, just like you used to go down to 12th Street in Kansas City, Missouri, back in, say, the 50s, how it was packed with people, where all the big stores were there back then. Back down there, it was almost the same. It was like payday. Oh, yeah, everybody was out spending their money, But it was nice.
I think the interstate cut through Cottage Lane.
No, I don't remember Cottage Lane. I'll be there.
This
Might
is
have been
back
one
like
back.
1900, before you were born.
Oh, well, yeah.
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 So you started in 1948, and the flood came in 51. How
Yes.
did that affect you?
Okay. When the flood came, the levee broke back in Topeka, and it came through Armourdale, Argentine, and I was right there with the packing house district there. Okay, there was some big box trucks that came through there, and with the guys with loudspeakers, everyone has to leave immediately because the levee broke, and therefore you have to leave everything. And they said, get in this truck immediately, and they hauled us out of there. And they took us up into the Strawberry Hill area because that was the high area. And that was just across the bridge. Now, but because the water was coming from the west, which is Topeka, and but we got out before the flood came. And we had a 2-story house. The water went up to the 2nd floor about yay high on the 2nd floor.
Well, did you see a tidal wave coming? Just big
No, we didn't see anything.
Just the
Truck
water
took us out of
just
there.
started coming up.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, wasn't a tidal wave, but it was just a flash flood of water, which just broke over the dams, the river dikes rather, and that's the way that was.
Was the Shipley Company working pretty active at that time?
Well, everything was active at that time.
Was Moss Saddlery running then? Remember, right north of Shipley, across from the Golden Ox restaurant,
Right.
was Moss, and he made saddles. Do you remember him?
No, but there were several big stores there. Well, right where the Golden Ox was, and the exchange, the livestock exchange was right there next door to it.
Yeah.
But Joe, thank you for coming and sharing. We have just a few more minutes, and I'll let you take your seat, Joe. And
Okay.
thank you. Let's give everyone- And I'd like to have Mike come back and answer any question. We have about 5 minutes to do that. So one question that I have that I'll start out with, what was the role of Lula Long Combs in the American Royal?
You'll have to ask somebody other than me. It was horses, I know that. And show horses, I do know that. But beyond that, I really don't. I'm sorry.
Okay.
That's not my area that I go into.
Well, and I just might say for the audience
Yeah,
that
that'd be great.
we show a video here on a regular basis that talks about her role. So she very much had a role. She lived in this house, raised her family here and so forth. But
And the horse
and then
farm.
later on moved on to Longview Ranch, where the Longs relocated when they donated the mansion to the city. Any other questions?
You got a question, ma'am?
Yes. What happened with the flood? Did all the packing houses go out of business?
Not right away. They cleaned up, rebuilt many of the stock pens, but again, it was a slow slide. What I didn't have time to say is the 50s really starts to begin to show how cattle are marketed differently, especially far fewer trains and more trucks. And you also see the establishment of feedlots out further west. That's why I mentioned about Hereford, Texas. That's really how it got its start, was as a feedlot center. So cattle would be fed out there and then brought in by truck rather than by train. So it's the death knell of the livestock train as well. That's why we can't find cattle cars anymore. They're so rare because they were surplused off or left to rot in fields and so on. So there were multiple things that contributed, but the flood was the great precipitator specific to the Kansas City stockyard. It did rebuild, but it was never the same. It was never the same. I want to say their last auction was 91, and that's when they finally sold the last cattle. But they've rebuilt a good bit of it. Same thing with the packing houses, yeah.
Is there any movement to have a museum about all this history?
What a great question. That's my dream, ma'am, frankly, is I'd love to see, first of all, the Shipley building deserves to be on the National Register because it's all there. I mean, the foundry was on the roof where they made all the spurs and bits and so on. It's still there. Everything's still in there. But it needs to be on the National Register as Historic Places. It's an architectural landmark for Kansas City, but it is non-marked. There are people here in terms of preservation, architectural preservation, who are trying to get it done. But you have to have cooperation from the people who are involved who own the property. But my dream, of course, is to someday create a stockyards museum because obviously it's a pretty big story with lots of moving parts. And the Shipley, to me, could be part of that. I don't know if it has to be part of it, but that's my dream. I think spirit lives in places, and I think the souls of all those people that worked in the stockyards are still down there. I do truly believe that, and that spreads out into Armourdale and Argentine and Strawberry Hill. So that's a long answer to your question.
Thank you. Could you elaborate a bit on the fact that roping came from West Africa?
Yeah, it goes a little like this. In the 8th century, North Africans conquered Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, and held it till 1492. That meant that riding horses became quite different. At the same time, managing livestock from the back of a horse is also brought from West Africa, but they generally use poles, long sticks, this sort of thing. Because of the need for a larger workforce in New Spain, and as I mentioned before, the Panuco Valley in east central Mexico, Spaniards aren't going to do that kind of work. The Peninsulares, noble-born Spaniards, they're not going to do that kind of work, nor are the Criollos, the ones who were Spaniards born in Mexico. They needed a workforce. So because Spanish law forbade native people from riding horses or mules, they weren't allowed to do that work either, even though they'd been enslaved in other respects. So blacks were brought from West Africa, who brought roping technology with them because they're cattle herders. And those cattle herders rope from foot, usually with the other end of the rope tied to a log or a rock. And so what happens in Mexico is the coalescing of the roping technology with riding a la jineta, which means up in the air. And that's what the North Africans introduced. So they come together in eastern Mexico, and that's the cowboy. That's the vaquero, is right there. That make sense? Yes, ma'am.
Would you elaborate on what your suspicions are?
About?
What you said at the end. Why this story is buried.
Because there are those in Kansas City, and I'm not a politically correct person. My wife's back there frowning at me, but I'm going to try to ignore her. There are those in Kansas City who want that story to go away and stay away. That big eraser I was talking about, that's still very much in place. You know, because it smells, and it's really just very, very basic. It smelled bad.
I grew up with that smell.
Well, me too,
It's part of
right?
my life.
But it is part of the story. The story's the story. I mean, you can whitewash things all you want. You can make things disappear all you want. That didn't make them go away. And that's why I think these descendants of these people, and so appreciate your comments, sir. Thank you very much for what you said. His voice needs to be heard because he's not alone. There are thousands of him out there, I guarantee you right now. And we need to continue that oral history project, get his words recorded and all the others. But they also have other things besides their memories, some material culture objects and things that need to be in a museum so we can tell that story. You will not find this in Chicago. You will not find it in Omaha. You will not find it in Denver. And the important thing to remember is not only was the Kansas City stockyards the primary Western beef market, and hogs and sheep as well, but also the American Royal was the show. It was the show in the whole West, bigger than Denver, bigger than Houston, bigger than San Antonio. I'm serious. It was the biggest livestock show, and the rodeo was part of that. And yet, in all those former cow towns, it's all gone. You don't find it in Chicago or St. Louis anywhere. Because they're progressive now, you see. They've moved beyond that story. It's just heartbreaking. And it's wrong. Yes?
Do you have any information on sort of the infrastructure that supported that, the water, the waste, all of that? It seems like 30,000 cattle a day coming through there feels like a massive undertaking.
It's a lot, and of course, and I so appreciate Ron asking about the conditions. You know, read the Upton Sinclair book. The conditions in the meat packing plants were horrible initially, but Kansas City was always considered above everybody else, better than Chicago, not because of promoters here, but because they were always on the cutting edge to stay ahead of that, right? So the jungle by Upton Sinclair really indicted the meat processing industry in the country. But likewise in the stockyards, you know, when we know better, we do better. It's as simple as that. There has been recent research on this. There's a recent book, and I cannot remember the gentleman's name, but if you go on the website for the Missouri Valley Collection at the Kansas City Public Library, there's some mini articles in there, and some of them are ultimately published, which is some of my own research is based on other people. But at the same time, yes, and it deserves better study. One of the things I do need to say about Bill Hall is that when he bought the Livestock Exchange Building, the archives for the Kansas City Stockyards was still in the building. Literally blueprints of every gate, every alley, down to the shape and hardware of the hasps on every gate. You see what I mean? It's all right there. It just needs to be told.
So were they hauling like manure out of there by the truckload?
Oh, absolutely. Of course.
And taking it where and dumping it? I mean, it seems like it'd just be a daily...
Initially went in the river.
The river?
Oh, yeah. Remember, that's how people did stuff.
Yeah.
It went washed away with somebody else's problem downstream, right? But I know it sounds awful to us, but remember, we can't judge things by a 21st century lens. That's not fair. It's just not. But when we know better, we do better. And so yes, they improved constantly. Remember, it's about a product. If the animal stays healthy, you make more money. Simple as that. And so dealing with the waste was a big part of that, absolutely.
I'd like to thank. Es un placer tenerte aquí con nosotros. Es un honor. Yeah.